It's a little bit different than the title was sent out, because as I was preparing this year, as I mentioned to Harold earlier, so literally I finished the sheet this morning, but and I realized that there was more than enough to talk about just in terms of the we'll call it the minhag of saying Hallel in Shul on the night of Pesach. It's the only time, of course, that we say Hallel at night as a whole, and that's the perhaps other than those people who are noheg to say Hallel at Yom Ha'atzmaut at night. But basically this is the and to a certain extent maybe I'll mention it also. That's the template, I guess, that you could say that the Rav Goren, when he institute saying Hallel on at the night of Yom Ha'atzmaut, so he is working off of what goes. So where does this come from? What's the idea of? Is there a difference between saying Hallel at the Seder and saying Hallel in the Shul? Various elements of Hallel, which are should one say with a bracha in Shul? Should one say not with the bracha in Shul? Why don't we say a bracha at the Seder itself? Is that something which is universal? So that's what we're going to talk about today. So let me share the screen with you, share the Makorot. As soon as where is it? Hold on one second. No, that's not it. I apologize. Second, I had it up before, now I don't see it. I have to find it. Just give me 1 second. I apologize for the delay. There we go. Okay, so so as you can see here, everyone see the Makorot? Is it clear?
Yes, we can see them. Could you?
Okay, so let me just make it a little bit bigger.
Yeah, that'd be good. And if you're not on mute, please check and go on mute.
Okay, so let's take a look at these Makorot. So where does the idea of saying Hallel in Shul come from? And we're going to see that there's some controversy with regard to this. But first, let's talk about the idea of saying Hallel in general. So the Tosefta says in a couple of places, I brought one of them. Tosefta says the following: Shmona Asar Yom B'Shana, V'Layla Echad, Korin Bo Behen Et Hallel. So 18 days a year and one night we read the Hallel. Ve'eluhen Shmonat Yimei Achag, Shmonat Yimei Chanukah, Yom Tov Rishon Shel Pesach V'Leilo, V'Yom Tov Shel Atzeret. So the 18 days, they're the 8 days of Sukkot and Shmini Atzeret. There are the 8 days of Chanukah. There's the first day of Pesach. All right, this is where you say the entire Hallel. Not going. Maybe I'll mention why we don't say the Hallel, the full Hallel, the rest of Pesach. But that won't be the focus of our shir. And Yom Tov Shel Atzeret, and the Yom Tov of Atzeret. Now here, the emphasis here was also on the night of Pesach, Laila Echad and Laila Echad. Okay, so this is a reference to the saying of the Hallel on the night of the Seder. Now, it's not totally clear. Are we talking about, we have it's the term that's used is korinbo, right? It's in the plural. Does that mean that it's dealing with the tzibur that's saying it, or simply that this is the day that it's said and we will be saying it at the Seder? Now, during the time of the Beit HaMikdash, the custom was to have the Hallels stated in two times. One time was when the Korban Pesach was being sacrificed on Erev Pesach, what we call Erev Pesach. So while that was going on in the courtyard of the Beit HaMikdash, so the Leviim were singing Hallel, and presumably people were joining in with them. So that's one time that it was being said in Beit HaMikdash, and also was being said as people ate their Korban Pesach. So here, this Tosefta is after the Korban, but it's not totally clear. What are we referring to? Are we talking about when people are sitting at their Seder, so they should be saying Hallel along the same lines that they used to say it when they ate the Korban Pesach? Or is this referring to perhaps a communal reading along the lines of the other 18 times, right? The other 18 days that we referred to during the day. So that's communal, and that's when people would be saying the Hallel at Shachrit. So similarly, we could have a communal reading of Hallel at night at Pesach. So presumably, it's not totally clear. The best guess would be that there isn't any clear indication that this is being said in the Bet Knesset. So presumably this is not referring to the Bet Knesset, but rather it's referring to each person or each family saying it together at their Seder. Similarly, the Yerushalmi quoting this also says the same type of idea, quotes a Braita, presumably the same Braita, Shmona Asar Yom Laila Echad Korin Bahen et Hallel B'chol Shana. Again, Laila Echad is being stressed here in the Yerushalmi, and we have Yom Tov Rishon Shel Pesach V'Leilo, the exact same formulation. It's important to note that in the Bavli, this Braita is brought as well. And here, the Bavli explains that a little bit more in depth, namely that you have, first of all, it's referring to the 18 days. Yachid Shmona Asar Yom Shachid Gomer Bahen et Hallel, completes the Hallel. And this is a little bit different. Before we said Korin, you read the Hallel. And here we're saying Ligmor et Hallel, to complete the Hallel. The bracha that people say, the Sfardim, their bracha is Ligmor et Hallel. The Ashkenazim say Likro et Hallel. But be that as it may for the moment, here in the Bavli, there is no mention of Laila. Shmona Asar Yamim Sheyachid Gomer Bahen et Hallel, Shmona Yemei Chag, Shmona Yemei Chanukah, Yom Tov Rishon Shel Pesach, and it is, for all of us who are familiar now with the Tosefta and with the Yerushalmi, the fact that here the night is not mentioned is significant. Now, one could say that the reason why this is not being stated is not that there's a machloket per se between the earlier sources and the Bavli, but simply the Bavli is discussing what goes on in the Bet Knesset. When the Tosefta spoke, when the Yerushalmi spoke about the night, so they were referring to when Hallel is stated. But here, we're talking about when Hallel is said in the communal forum, and that only takes place during the day, it never takes place at night, and the Bavli therefore just deleted that part of the Braita because it wasn't really relevant to what was being discussed in terms of the general staying of Hallel in the Tzibur, in the Bet Knesset. Here you have also a new reference to Uvagola Esrim Ve'echad. It's here the previous two sources had been were Eretz Yisrael sources, focusing on what goes on here. However, the Bavli, of course, is also interested in what goes on in Chutz La'aretz. So in Chutz La'aretz, we don't have 18 days, but we have 21 days. And here the explanation is because there are now 9 days of Sukkot and Shmini Atzeret, still 8 days of Chanukah, 2 days, the first 2 days of Pesach, and 2 days of Atzeret of Shavuot. So that adds up to 21. Now the Gemara asks the question, which the original Braita, this is presumably a reworking of that Braita. The Bavli now asks the question, which is, Maishna b'chag d'amrinan kol yoma, Maishna b'pesach d'lo amrinan kol yoma. Why on Sukkot do we say complete? Now remember, the emphasis was on the word gomer, to finish, to complete the Hallel. Why don't we complete the Hallel? Why do we say what we call the Chatzi Hallel, that the abridged Hallel during Pesach, and but on Chag we say it throughout? And here the answer, which is the primary answer, and as I said, I'm not going to be focusing on the question today of why don't we say Hallel on Chol HaMoed of Pesach. However, here the answer is not the answer that most people might be familiar with. There's no mention here in terms of the question of our sensitivity to the plight of the Egyptians, but rather the idea specifically of the Chag chalukin b'korbanotehen, the Pesach ein chalukin b'korbanotehen. There is on Sukkot, each day of Chol HaMoed has its own unique korban musaf. We start with the 13 different bulls that are brought, and we could decrease in order until we reach 7 on the 7th day of Sukkot. And of course, Shmini Atzeret has its own korban. Because of that, so the Hallel has its own unique character as well, and therefore you complete the Hallel. However, on Pesach, the korban musaf, which is brought on each day of Chol HaMoed, is identical to the korban musaf which is brought on the first day. Similarly, the korban musaf on the 7th day, even though it's Yom Tov, is identical to the korban musaf that's brought on the first day of Pesach. It's indicating that really there is one, if you will, one kedusha or one character of Pesach, which is unique for the full 7 days, whereas Sukkot, there is a perhaps subtle, but a distinction between each one of the days of Chol HaMoed, and therefore the Hallel, which is connected to the Chag, the Hallel, which is connected to the Musaf, is going to have a full Hallel on each day, whereas once you've already said the Hallel on the first day of Pesach, so then you don't have to say a complete Hallel on the rest of Pesach. The halacha happens to be that if for whatever the reason a person doesn't say Hallel on the first day of Pesach, whatever the reason he or the community was unable to say Hallel, so then you say the complete Hallel on the first opportunity that you have during Pesach, but for this reason. But basically, this is the rationale. And but getting back to our primary discussion, there is no mention of the night of Pesach here. And again, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's an argument as to whether you should be saying it at night. But the idea here is that I'm saying at night, when it's being said, is being said in the at the Seder, and it's not being said at Shul. So that's why this Braita, or the way that the Bavli brings the Braita, deletes that line. So that's what we would have. In other words, we have a noting that we do say Hallel at night. Presumably the Hallel that's being stated at night is at the home, as we're all familiar with as part of our Seder. And that's what these sources all deal with. Now, the Chazal continue with other sources that clearly talk about saying Hallel in Shul on Seder night. And the question is, what is the background for it? So the first source that we have, and we'll go in basically in chronological order of the sources themselves. The first source here is also a Tosefta, and the Tosefta is compiled in the beginning of the 3rd century. And the Tosefta reads as following: B'nei ha'ir she'ein lahen mishi yikra lahen et ha'Hallel, hochin lebeit ha'knesset, v'korin perek rishon, v'holchin v'ochlin v'shotin v'chozrin u'ba'in v'gomrin et kula. So here we have a situation where the townsfolk don't have anyone who is familiar enough with the Hallel to say it at home. Now, remember, we're talking about the beginning of the 3rd century. The Haggadah is in its formative stages. It's not totally clear what of the Haggadah that we say is there. This is a different discussion. Now is not the time to talk about what was the Haggadah of the Beit HaMikdash and what was the Haggadah of the early Churban period, which we're talking about here. But you have certainly, whatever the text is, you don't have a lot of actual manuscripts around. You don't have the Maxwell House manuscript, as it were, of the Haggadah to be saying the Haggadah. Most people don't have written Haggadot, and not everyone is familiar with the text of the Hallel. So if you're unable, people don't know the Hallel, so then you go to the Bet Knesset and you read the first parak. In other words, this is also a machloket between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. We follow the opinion of Beit Hillel that you read the first 2 prakim of the Hallel before the meal, and the rest of the Hallel after the meal. The Beit Shammai was of the opinion that you read only the first parak of the Hallel, and you read the rest of the Hallel after the meal. This Braita, this Tosefta, seems to be following the opinion of Beit Shammai, that you read only the beginning of the Hallel, the first parak, but you would do this in the public forum. V'holchin v'ochlin. So after you finish, then you go home and you eat your meal. V'chozrin uvain v'gomrin et kulo. But of course, you now have to finish the Hallel. So basically, if you will, you have already a b'diavad situation. You have a situation where people aren't totally literate. They don't know the text of the Hallel. So you go to the Bet Knesset, you say the first parak, you go home, you finish your Seder, then you come back to the Bet Knesset and you say the rest of the Hallel. As you can imagine, this is probably not going to happen all that often, that you might be able to get the people to come to Shul the first time, but to get them to leave their meals after they've already been eating and drinking. Remember, 4 cups of wine, or maybe not the 4th cup yet, because that's been said on the Hallel, but you now have 3-4 cups of wine. Now you're going to come back to Shul. You have to coordinate the time, and people don't have watches. So this is going to be a little bit tricky. So the Bright is aware of that and says, "V'imi efshalahen gomrinet kulo ha'halel." So if this is impossible, it's just not practical, as you can imagine. So then you say the entirety of the Hallel before the meal, before the Seder. You say Hallel in Shul, then you go back and you have your Seder at home. So what it sounds like at this point is that the ideal situation is that you don't say Hallel in Shul at all. You will go, everyone will go home, have their Seder, and as part of the Seder, they'll say Hallel. If that is not going to happen because people are unfamiliar with the Hallel, then you try to mimic the Seder structure in the Shul. You'll read a parak or 2 of the Hallel before people go home. Then they'll go home, they'll have their meals, then everyone will come back for the remainder of the Hallel. If that is impractical, so then you say the entire Hallel before the Seder, and then you go home, and presumably people would not say the Hallel at that point because you've already said Hallel in Shul. There's no point in saying Hallel at your Seder. Okay, so that seems to be the first stage. We go on to the next stage of this, if you will, the unfolding of this of saying Hallel in Shul, and how you have the Yerushalmi. This is taken out of a larger discussion in the Yerushalmi with regard to the structure of the brachot and the text of the brachot, which is a little bit too involved for us right now. But the key line for us is the following: De'amar or Demar Rabbi Yochanan, who is now at the beginning of the 4th century. So this is about 100 years or so, maybe a little bit less, 70 years after the Tosefta has been compiled. So Rabbi Yochanan says the following: Hallel im shama bebeit hakneset yatsa. So if you have heard the Hallel in the Shul, so then you're Yotzei, you're Chova. Now, it doesn't talk about here a situation where people are not saying Hallel because they are not, not saying Hallel in their own Seder because they're unfamiliar with it. It sounds as simply that, okay, if you happen to be in a community where they are saying it and you know it, so then you still don't have to say the Hallel in your own Seder because you've already been Yotzei at Shul. And so this is not so it's not total, I wouldn't quite call it a lichatchila necessarily. In other words, what's the background here? Or is why are you saying it in Shul? Is there because some of the people are unfamiliar with it and you are familiar with it, so now you don't have to say it? Is it that perhaps at this point already people have just, it's become instituted to say it for those people who don't know it? So for example, very similar to the custom that many of us are familiar with in Chutz La'aretz to say Kiddush in Shul on Friday night. That began because people were eating their meals in Shul, or some people, guests in the community, poor people, etc., were in the Shul eating their meals. So they would say Kiddush immediately after Arvit. And we continue with that, even though most people are, or maybe perhaps all people in the community are going home. But nevertheless, we have begun this custom of saying Kiddush in Shul. So we continue with the custom of saying Kiddush in Shul. Similarly here, we began with the custom of saying Hallel for those people who were unfamiliar or unable to say Hallel themselves. The communities, this is also in Eretz Israel, Rabbi Yochanan is speaking, and the Yerushalmi as well, where that this community, this minhag has become entrenched. So Rabbi Yochanan saying, okay, you say Hallel in Shul, even if now in this community, everyone knows the Hallel. But because we've said it in Shul, you don't have to say it at the Seder, Yatzah. There are those who want to claim that Rabbi Yochanan is not talking about the saying of Hallel, though that's what it would sound as though, but rather he's talking about the question of saying a bracha. We're going to talk about the question in a moment, whether you should be saying a bracha in the Hallel. But most likely, it doesn't sound that way. It sounds as though Rabbi Yochanan is talking about saying Hallel itself and not whether you should be saying a bracha with the Hallel. We continue a few hundred years on, and now we are in Masechet Sofrim. Masechet Sofrim is a later work which was compiled most likely shortly after the Bavli was compiled. So we're talking about something around the 6th, 7th century, and it employs sources from earlier works, including the Yerushalmi, including the Bavli. So here we have a Braita. This is the Braita which we're familiar with in its Bavli form, which we saw before. Tani Rabbi Shimon ben Yotzadak Omer, which is the same as here, Rabbi Yochanan Mishum Rabbi Shimon ben Yotzadak. The name before in the Yerushalmi is not quoted. Yamim Shmona Asar v'Laila Echad Yachid Gomer, but here it includes the Laila Echad. So that's important to note. Yachid Gomer Bahenet Hallel. And then we have the 18 days, and we also have the addition of the Babli that we saw before, Uvagola Echad Esrim Yom V'Leilot. We also have that, which we spoke about before. So we'll just highlight that, the 21 days. And now it's here, what doesn't appear in the Babli was that there are 2 nights, right, that you're going to be saying it. If you're in Chutz La'aretz, you're going to be saying it the first and the second night because you have 2 Sedarim. Now, u'mitzvah min ha'muvchar, now this is totally new. Mitzvah min ha'muvchar likrot et ha'halel b'shnei lo'yot shel goliot u'levarech alehen u'la'omran b'ni'imah l'kayem ma shene'amar u'nerama ma shemo yachdav. So here we have a totally new formulation. Basically, it's a mitzvah min hamufchar. It is something which is which is we find particularly praiseworthy to read the Hallel both nights, and here make a bracha, to say it in a pleasant tune, l'kayem ma shene'emar, to fulfill the pasuk, u'neromemo shemo yachdav, to lift up God's name together. By using that pasuk, and that's very, very telling, that pasuk, because here, until we saw this pasuk, I mean, we could be asking, it seems a little strange. We know, of course, the minhag or the halacha of saying Hallel at the Seder. So you're saying, okay, mitzvah min hamuvchar likrot et Hallel. I could say maybe it's a special mitzvah to do it in your own Seder and not to be doing it in Shul. But here that's not the case. Niromema shemo yachdav means to be saying it together. Because we're basically saying here, the Masechet Sofrim is saying that there is value in saying Hallel in the Shul itself as part of a tzibur. That we shouldn't just be saying the Hallel as part of our own individual Sedarim, but that we should be saying it as part of a community. And Hallel is something which has power because it's a communal prayer. That is the focus. So here, what has become, if we can, and I'm following here the approach of Rabbi Professor David Henschken, his work Manishtana, which I highly recommend for those people who are unfamiliar with it. Here, I happen to have the copy right here, so I'll just put it up. This is the book, David Henschke's book of Manishtana. It's a very thick volume, which deals with the development of the Seder and the Haggadah. So he just views this here as basically being a historical development. What we started as saying the following: we started with the idea of saying Hallel in Bet Knesset as very much a b'di'avad, very much as a situation because there are people who are in the community who are illiterate and aren't able to say the Hallel, and it was originally stated for those people and those people alone, only those communities. It now becomes, in the next stage, and what Rabbi Yochanan had said, has become more entrenched in Eretz Yisrael. Many communities have this problem, perhaps, and as a result, there is a universal or a near universal custom of saying Hallel in Shul. And Rabbi Yochanan says that if you happen to be in one of those communities, even if you're able to say Hallel by yourself, you don't need to, because you've already been fulfilled your mitzvah of Hallel by saying it with the tzibur. And then we now have the next stage, where basically in Masechet Sofrim, it's become something which is desirable. We want to have this. We want people to be saying the Hallel. A similar phenomena happens in terms of Kiddush. A little bit later, in the time of the Rishonim, once the custom has become entrenched to say Kiddush on Friday night in the Shul, so there are those Rishonim who say that this is something which is a lechatchila, not because there might be guests in the Shul, but because it is a means of the community being Mekadesh the Shabbat together. So something similar is happening here as well. Now, however, this is different than what Rabbi Yochanan said, because now the next line is when you now read it, you've just been in Shul, you said it in Shul with a bracha, Eino tzarich levarech shekvar birech berabim. When you now go home and you say your Hallel in your home, you don't have to say with a bracha because you've already made the bracha in the Shul. So this is the stage, if you will, now in the 6th, 7th century, that people are saying Hallel in Shul with a bracha, and they do not say Hallel with a bracha at home. What would happen if you're in a community where you didn't say Hallel in the Shul? Should you say Hallel with a bracha or not? You could make the diuk, if you will, in this Masechet Sofrim, that only because you made the bracha in Shul do you not make a bracha at home? But if you are in a situation where you did not say the bracha in shul because there was no Hallel in shul, so then you should say a bracha at your own Seder. And we're going to see that there are those Rishonim who understood it that way. From the textual evidence, because we have many Haggadot, or I don't know, many, certainly, but more than a few Haggadot from Eretz Yisrael, from this period, from the 7th, 8th, 9th centuries, that were found in the Geniza as well. There is no record of a bracha being made in the Hallel of the Seder. You would expect to see the bracha being found in the text of the manuscript, but you don't see that. On the other hand, the Sidurim from that period in Eretz Yisrael have Hallel in the Bet Knesset with a bracha. So so you could argue that you still don't know with 100% assurity. There might be other manuscripts that we just don't have. There could be a situation that since most communities are saying Hallel with a bracha in the Bet Knesset, so therefore the Hallel, the manuscript of the Haggadot, delete the bracha, and it's only a sort of a b'diavad that you'd say the bracha in the Hallel, in the Hallel of the Seder. So it's not a totally clear record that we can know for sure what's going on, but it would seem that there was a bracha being said and the Hallel was being said in the Bet Knesset. However, there was no bracha being said at the Hallel in the Seder. Okay, we're going to come back to that in a little bit, but right now that would seem to be what was actually going on. And we'll also try to give perhaps some explanations from not only from a historical perspective, but from a analytic perspective as to what the nature of the bracha is all about in just a bit. But before we get to that, the question now is, okay, this is where we have three sources from Eretz Yisrael. First, the Tosefta talking about the situation where you have a community where people are unable to say the Hallel themselves because they just are unfamiliar with the text. The next stage, which we saw Rabbi Yochanan, where it seems to become a universal custom, and the third stage of the Masechet Sofrim, where it is considered to be the desired communal response that we say a Nuroma Mashmo Yachtav, that we say Hallel in the Shul. What about in Bavel? What's going on there? And so we have absolutely no record in the Babylonian sources, not in the Gemara, not in the Gaonim, in no sources at all of saying Hallel in Shul in Bavel. This seems to be a specifically Eretz Yisrael minhag. We know that there are many distinctions between the customs of Eretz Yisrael of this period and the customs of Bavel at this period. And this could very well be one of those instances that in Eretz Yisrael, the custom has developed to say Hallel in the Shul. And once, by the way, you're saying Hallel in Shul, so the way that you always say a bracha with Hallel in Shul, so you're going to say a bracha in this Hallel as well. And in Bavel, that custom just never develops. And that could also be why, now getting back, if that's the case, why in the earlier source that we saw, when the Gemara quotes the idea of saying Hallel on the different Yom Tovim, the 18 days, the 21 days, why specifically the Bavli did not mention the night, because the Bavli was only concerned with the communal saying of Hallel. And in Bavel, they didn't say Hallel in the Bet Knesset. They only said it in the home on the night of the Seder, and therefore it wasn't relevant to the discussion, and the Bavli simply deletes that idea because it's just not a part of it's not a din of the tzibur saying Hallel, but rather it's a component of the Seder. This, now, if we go a little bit, jump ahead in terms of this isn't so historical, but this is now several hundred years later, where the Rishonim, who are familiar with all of these sources, are looking back and trying to figure out what's going on with the sources. So the Rishonim. So here we'll first start with the Sefer Rokeach. Sefer Rokeach is a source that is found from the end of the 12th century in Rav Elazar of Worms, of Vermeiza, who was a student of Rabbi Yehuda Chassid, the end of the 12th century, beginning of the 13th century. And he writes the following: Masechet Sofrim K'tiv b'shnei leilot shel Pesach gormin et Hallel. However, aval beperek sheni de'erchin lo chashiv lo. So he just simply says, listen, it's interesting, perhaps, that the Masechet Sofrim talks about it, but it's not found in the Bavli. This is not normative for us here in, even though he's writing this in Germany in the 13th century, he's saying we follow the Babylonian custom. We don't follow the Eretz Yisrael custom. So the fact that it's found in Masechet Sofrim is all very interesting, but it's not something which is going to define halacha for us. And therefore, there is no saying of Hallel in the Bet Knesset. The Meiri, who was not quite, in fact, we'll get to this, we'll talk a little bit more about Hallel and Bet Knesset, where it's being said in Ashkenaz, in Germany, in Tzarfat, in France. In other words, what we would call Ashkenazic custom. There isn't any record in the medieval period of saying Hallel in Shul at all. This is going to become a Sephardic custom, which we'll talk about that, its development. The Meiri, who is here in source number 8, the Meiri is in southern France, in Provence, which is a sort of a third community. You have the Ashkenazim and the French, and you have the Spanish communities, the Northern African communities, the Rif, the Rambam, who don't mention it at all either. And then you have this third community, which was expelled from southern France in the 14th century, and sort of as a result was absorbed by the other major communities. But here this is now in the end of the 13th century in southern France, in Provence, he says the following: Vuhu, he tries to explain what's going on in terms of the Bet Knesset. Vuhu shaya minhagam likro et Hallel bebeit Knesset mib'od yom zecher laHallel sheba'azara. So he changes, I wouldn't say changes, he's trying to understand it from his perspective, but he's giving a different way of looking at it. He's saying that basically remember, he doesn't have a historical or a actual living example of this. So he tries to say that basically what was going on isn't the way that I explained it a moment ago. It wasn't that this is an outgrowth of the idea of not knowing the Hallel, but rather the idea that the custom developed to say Hallel on what we would call Erev Pesach, before Arvit, or perhaps after Mincha on the night of Pesach, and to say the Hallel at that point before Arvit. And the reason for that is because we have a very clear Misorah of what was being said in the Beit HaMikdash when the Korban Pesach was being sacrificed on Erev Pesach. And it's very clear in the Mishnayot and Pesachim that Hallel was being said at that point. We don't say that in Hallel anymore. Think about it. We don't have that Hallel because we don't bring the Korban Pesach. We only have the Hallel of the Seder. So now this custom developed to say Hallel the way that it was said in the Beit HaMikdash. In the Beit HaMikdash, Hallel was said twice. One was when the entire community, all of Am Yisrael, was bringing their Korban Pesach, and the Mishnah said that there were so many people that had to be done in 3 different shifts. And then the Hallel was being said while the Korban Pesach was being sacrificed in a communal setting. That is the what we would do comparable would be in the Bet Knesset, and then we go home and we eat our Korban Pesach and say Hallel again. That's time of the Beit HaMikdash. We don't have the Korban Pesach, l'tzarenu, so therefore we go home and we have our Seder, and we say the Hallel the way that they would have said the Hallel with their Korban Pesach. That's the way that the Meiri is looking at this Masechet Sofrim, which would mean that the Meiri also would not have said Hallel in the Bet Knesset before the Seder, and in order to explain try to, if you will, put the framework on that particular custom of the Masechet Sofrim. And then he says, Kol shebirech b'Beit HaKnesset eino ta'un bracha rishona lehalel. Anybody who says it there doesn't have to say the bracha and Hallel, and we're going to talk about that in just one moment. So here we have the what would seem to be a Eretz Yisrael minhag to be saying Hallel in the Bet Knesset. Doesn't have a parallel, to the best of our knowledge, no record of it in Bavel, not in the time of the Gemara, not in the time of the Gaonim, not mentioned at all by later Rishonim, the early Rishonim, the Rif, the Rambam, etc. Not found in Spain. Here in Germany, we have a clear indication, based on at least on some of the Deot, that you shouldn't be saying it in the Bet Knesset, that this is a minhag of the Yerushalmi, not a minhag of the Bavli. You have in Provence another community where there is an attempt to try to explain it as having been done at a certain time as a remembrance for what was done in the Beit HaMikdash. So at this point, if you were to stop the presses at this point, in the 14th century, it doesn't seem to be being said, or the 13th century, doesn't seem to be being said at all anymore. It was said in Eretz Yisrael for a certain period of time. That custom seems to have died out. And so if we were to stop the clock in the 13th century, it doesn't seem that there is anyone saying the Hallel in Bet Knesset at all. Now, let's take a break for a second from the discussion of Hallel and Beit Knesset and go to the question of saying Hallel with a bracha or without a bracha. We are all familiar with with our Haggadot that you don't say a bracha at the Seder. Right? You can't find a Haggadah with the bracha in the Seder. Is that something which is universally accepted? And interestingly enough, it is a huge controversy. Maybe huge is an exaggeration, but it's a pretty big controversy in the period of the Rishonim, starting in the 13th century, that we have a record of it, 13th, 14th, 15th century, where there is a major question as to whether you should be saying a bracha with the Hallel in the Seder. And we have here many manuscripts from that period of time where in the Haggadot, there is a bracha for the Hallel, reflecting the opinions that say you should be saying a bracha at the Hallel. We're going to see that maybe, believe it or not, even two brachot in the Seder. And we'll get to that right now. Where does that come from? So one source that you could get the idea of saying a bracha in the Hallel, in the Seder, is from this Masechet Sofrim that we've been discussing. Because here in the Masechet Sofrim, it said that you say the Hallel in the Shul with a bracha, and if you said it with the bracha in the Shul, so then you don't have to say a bracha in your Seder, implying that if you didn't say it in the Shul, then you do have to say a bracha in your Seder. Now, since, as I've just said, it seems to be, again, I have to couch all of these assumptions with a little bit of doubt, because just because you don't have a record doesn't prove necessarily that it wasn't going on. But we don't have a record of anyone saying a Hallel in the Shul in the 12th, in the 11th, 12th, 13th centuries. So if that's the case, So then, where does what do you do in your Seder? But you know the source of Masechet Sofrim, and Masechet Sofrim said that if you don't say it if you do say it in Shul, you don't say a bracha at home, implying that if you don't say it in Shul, then you should say a bracha at home, and then there you have the bracha. So that's one potential source that would indicate that you should have a bracha for your Hallel. However, there's another source which comes up from the Bavli itself. The Bavli says the following: the Mishnah in the 10th parak of Psachim, Mishnah simply going through the order of the Seder, says Mazgulo kol shlishi. You pour the third cup of wine. Mevarech shal mizona. So then you make your bracha. You make your birkat hamazon. You say your benching with the cup. Fine. Revi'i gomer alav et Hallel. So at the fourth cup you complete the Hallel. That's fine. V'omer alav birkat hashir. Now we add on another bracha. We say the bracha of birkat hashir. The Mishnah doesn't tell me what birkat hashir, the bracha of the song, is. It just says that you should say the bracha of the shir. The Gemara wants to know what is this bracha, and the Gemara brings machloket. And machloket is reflected in the text of our Haggadot to this very day. What's the machloket? My birkat hashir. Rav Yehuda, excuse me, not Rabbi Yehuda, Rav Yehuda Amar, Yahalucha Hashem Elokeinu. Rabbi Yochanan Amar, Nishmat Kolcha. So we have the machloket between Rav Yehuda and Rabbi Yochanan as to whether you should say the bracha at the end of Yahalucha, which is the same bracha that we say at the end of every Hallel that we state, or the bracha should be Nishmat Kol Chai. In different Haggadot, the order changes. When you say the bracha at the end, do you say it before or after Nishmat? We'll leave that question aside at the moment. But here we have a indication that you're saying the bracha at the end of Hallel. And that's, so what about the bracha at the beginning of Hallel? That's not mentioned. So how do we deal with that? So there is, as I said, a great deal of discussion in the Rishonim on this topic. I picked one Rishon for brevity's sake, the same Meiri that we read before, and he has a lengthy piece, actually two lengthy pieces, one here and one in Brachot, where he discusses it. But he gives a nice summary of the major shitot, and that's why I chose this opinion as opposed to some of the other sources that are available. So he says the following: Yesh shoalin. There are those who ask. Source number 10 here. Yesh shoalin ba ha'ech mevarchin la'acharav v'lo birachnu lefanav. So we just spoke about the bracha at the end of the Hallel, birchat hashir. What happened to the bracha at the beginning? Harei amru b'mesechet nida perak shishi kol ta'un bracha la'acharav ta'un bracha lefanav. So we have a klal in brachot that if you have a closing bracha along the lines, we have, let's say, psuke de zimra. So you start with Baruch Sha'amar, you finish with Yishtabach. You have birchot kriyat shema. You have the brachot before kriyat shema. You have the brachot after kriyat shema. So you don't have brachot after something if you didn't have a bracha beforehand. So presumably, if there is a birchat hashir, if there's this bracha that we are adding to the Hallel, so it was a given that there was also a bracha beforehand, and we know what that bracha is. That bracha is either likmor et Hallel, likro et Hallel, depending on your particular minhag. But the Mishnah didn't have to mention that because that was obvious. The Mishnah does have to mention that there is a bracha at the end, and then of course the question is, what is that bracha? And beyond that, next question that he asks, the second bullet point, Va'od ha'ech birchat yalucha eina potachet bebaruch. So I have two questions. One is, or 2 points that would be indicative that you are having a bracha beforehand. Source number 1 is that we have a general rule that if you have a bracha at the end, you're going to also have a bracha at the beginning. The second aspect is the text of the second bracha. There's a general rule that all brachot have to start with the formulation of Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, unless it follows a previous bracha, without getting into exactly what is going on, why that is the case. But if you think about it, Shmona Esrei is your easiest example. You start your Shmona Esrei with a Baruch Atah Hashem, and all of the subsequent brachot, in our Shmona Esrei, there are 18 brachot after Magen Avraham. None of them will start with Baruch because they follow the earlier bracha. Birchot Kriyat Shema, same thing. You say the bracha, let's say, Ma'ariv Aravim, and after that, the other 3 brachot of Birchot Kriyat Shema in the evening don't begin with a Baruch Atah Hashem. One bracha leads, there's a chain of these brachot. Yahalucha or Yishtabach as well. You say Baruch Sha'amar, but you don't say a bracha with Yishtabach, right? It doesn't have a pticha of Baruch Atah Hashem because Yishtabach is following Baruch Sha'amar. Yahalucha is the same thing. In Hallel, generally speaking, you say Baruch Atah Hashem Likrat Hallel. Then you will say at the end of your Hallel, Yahalucha. You don't have to say Baruch Atah Hashem. In the Seder, you also say Yahalucha, and you don't say Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, Yahalucha, etc. Because presumably it's following an earlier bracha. So now there are several opinions. And it's really very fascinating how what you have here is because of this halachic understanding that you should be having a bracha at the beginning. People begin to say, okay, how should our Seder look? And here there are actually, he mentions 4 different approaches within this question. One is that katvu arbe mefarshim she mevarchin lefanav betchilat hallelujah ligmor et hallel. So based on this, many Rishonim that he quotes and is referring to would say that you say the bracha of ligmor et hallel. Ligmor et hallel is the standard bracha amongst the Sfaradim for every Hallel. So you have this idea that you're going to say Ligmor et Hallel at the beginning of your Seder Hallel, the first 2 prakim before the meal, and then you're going to continue Nimtza Brechat Yalucha Smucha L'Chaverta. Okay, so that's the first opinion. And then there's a bit of a discussion. Well, don't you have a hefsek? You have your meal in between. And the answer for that is that that's not considered to be a hefsek. It's all part of the same Hallel, the same way that you have a hefsek of Kriyat Shema, let's say, between your brachot, the 2 brachot before, and the bracha or the 2 brachot after Kriyat Shema. It's not considered to be a hefsek because it's part of the ritual. You have your bracha at the beginning of Tkiyat Shofar, and then you have Musaf, that's all involved, and you're going to have your 100 kolot according to our minhag, but that's all considered to be the same mitzvah because it's not considered to be a hefsek. So similarly, the meal of the Seder is part of the ritual, and that's not considered to be a hefsek. So that is the first opinion. However, he continues, and now just to we'll skip to Bet here. The second opinion. V'teida shektzad chachamim mevarchin likro b'shah shepotchin hallelujah ve'ein mevarchin ligmor hoel ve'eino gomro kodem achila So now this opinion says, well, let's face it, what's going on? We have it's true, normally speaking, we say the bracha of ligmor, to complete the Hallel. But here, you're not exactly completing the Hallel, at least not immediately after you said the bracha. You're going to say the bracha at the beginning, then you're only going to say the first two prakim. So you can't say ligmor et Hallel, but rather what you're going to do is you're going to say likro et Hallel. This is also very similar to what Ashkenazim do, and this is why Ashkenazim say likro et Hallel all year round and not ligmor et Hallel. Ashkenazim have the minhag to say a bracha for the Chatzi Hallel when you don't complete the Hallel. So therefore you can't say the bracha of ligmor et Hallel. You can only say the bracha likro et Hallel, to read the Hallel. And as a result, Ashkenazim, whenever they say Hallel, make the bracha of likro et Hallel and not ligmor et Hallel. Sfaradim will only make a bracha, generally speaking, when they say the entire Hallel. They don't say a bracha at all for Rosh Chodesh. They don't say a bracha during Chol HaMoed. So they continue with the text of ligmor et Hallel. This opinion is saying, well, what are we doing? We normally say ligmor et Hallel, but here we can't say ligmor et Hallel since we're not going to complete the Hallel immediately. So we say the bracha likro et Hallel. So that's the second opinion. V'yesh mivarchin ligmor. So there are those who argue and say, no, you should make the bracha ligmor because you're going to complete the Hallel afterwards. So you have two different opinions, one saying that the bracha should be likro et Hallel, one saying that you should say ligmor et Hallel. Now we come to the fourth opinion, or the third opinion perhaps. Adayin atat tzarich leidam yachzor v'yivarech ligmor b'tchilat lo lanu. So I could now say, one second, should I say only one bracha, or should I say an additional bracha after the meal? Bracha before I start the Hallel, those two prakim. Now I've had my meal, I've had a hefsek. So perhaps I should make another bracha to finish the Hallel after the meal. And he himself follows this opinion. He says, Nimtzu b'Hallel zeh shtei brachot. Achat kodem suda benusach likro, v'chatimata birkat geula, v'achat la'achar gmar suda benusach ligmor, v'chatimata yahalucha kach nirali. So the Meiri and others follow this opinion, or is that there's this third opinion now, to say that you should say the first bracha should be likro et Hallel. Then he says that there is actually a second part of that bracha, which asher ga'alanu, the bracha of geula that we say before the meal, and then after the meal we will now have a third. We'll say a bracha again, a second bracha ligmor et Hallel, and we're going to say yahalucha. So there are four brachot altogether that are around the Hallel. Right? So that's the third opinion. And then he says, the mikol makom hama chachamim ra'inu shelo hayu mevarchin lefanav klal. Having said all of this, there is now the opinion, which of course is our approach, that you don't say a bracha before Hallel at all, and not at the beginning of the meal and not afterwards. How do you work that out with the sources that we saw before? The source of the Bavli, which talks about Birchat Hashir, and we said, well, if you have Birchat Hashir, if you have a bracha at the end, so presumably you have a bracha beforehand as well as Masechet Sofrim. So these sources are deal with that, or these Rishonim deal with it. What do they say? They say that the very fact the very fact that the Gemara asks, and the Mishnah has to tell me that there's Birchat Hashir, is indicative that there was no first bracha. If there had been a first bracha, everyone should know what the structure of Hallel is. It's the same structure all year round. You make a first bracha, ligmor Hallel, likrot Hallel, and then you say your prakim of Hallel, and then you say the bracha at the end. So if there was a bracha beforehand, the Mishnah wouldn't have had to say V'omer la birchat hashir, and certainly the Gemara wouldn't have said what is birchat hashir, because we know what birchat hashir is. It's the same text that we have all year round. So that is indicative, this opinion says, that there was no bracha beforehand, and it's only because we have this unique situation that you are saying Hallel with a meal, that you're saying Hallel as part of the Haggadah. Therefore, you don't say a bracha. When did we institute a bracha for Hallel? Only as part of the liturgy. This isn't really part of the liturgy. This is part of the Haggadah service. And as part of that Haggadah, there is no bracha. The Hallel comes naturally as part of lefikach, we say in the Haggadah, because so many wonderful things have happened to us in real time. So we're going to say Hallel. You don't say a bracha in real time. You say bracha if you're commemorating something. So since we're not commemorating anything, we're saying something in real time, you don't have any bracha at all. At the end, we say birchat hashir, we say yahalucha, because it's not exactly a bracha of a mitzvah. It's a bracha of where we are speaking of the praise of God after the fact. So that's where, according to this, there is no bracha. And what about Masechet Sofrim, which indicated that if you didn't say it in Shul, you should say a bracha, that the idea was that in Shul, you had to say a bracha because you're not at your Seder. And what we're saying is that if once we don't have a bracha at the meal because you perhaps said a bracha earlier, so no bracha was ever instituted for this particular case. So here we have as I said, this controversy raged for about 200, 300 years as to whether you should be saying a bracha, and there were different Haggadot. Some said ligmor Hallel, some said likrot Hallel, some had one bracha, some had two brachot, some had no brachot. Comes the end of or the beginning of the 16th century, the Beit Yosef, Rav Yosef Karo, writing, summing it all up. And normally speaking, the Beit Yosef is very encyclopedic in terms of the way that he brings the sources. And he says here, he veers from his normal custom. It says, Binyan birchat Hallel. So when it comes to saying the bracha of the Hallel and the Seder, ika plukta de rabuta. So there's a major machloket, and he quotes the Ran, he doesn't quote the Meiri, but then he says, Katav harbe b'inyan zeh, much is written, ve'ein laharich, but I'm not going to bring any of it. Mipnei sheminhag kol ha'olam shelo levarech al Hallel. So by the time the 16th century is rolled around, it has become universal that there is no min bracha in the Hallel at the Seder. So the Beit Yosef feels I don't have to talk about it. And I'm not even going to discuss all of the proofs back and forth. But it's very interesting that that you had this controversy, which suddenly seems to have died down. Not totally clear why. Like, why don't you have, since there are many Rishonim, the Ramban, the Rashba, the Ritva, no, the major Sephardic Rishonim of the 13th and 14th century are saying that you should be saying brachot. In Provence, they're saying brachot in the Seder. In Ashkenaz, it's a machloket between different camps. Why then, by the 16th century, is no one saying a bracha? So the answer seems to be something that preceded all of this, and this is the approach of the Tur. The Tur is a Rishon of the son of the Rosh. He is living in the end of the 13th, beginning of the 14th century. And that's when he writes his major halachic work, which the Shulchan Aruch is based upon. And he says the following: Yesh mekomot shenoagin likrot Hallel bebeit hakneset betzibur, kidei shelo yitztarchu levarech alav b'shat haggadah, uma tov uma na'im hahi minhagah. So here, the Tur basically quotes this minhag and then he gives it his endorsement. And it's quite possible that this one line cut out an entire controversy that had raged for centuries. Basically, he says, listen, we have this big machloket. Should you be saying a bracha? Should you not be saying a bracha? But there's a way around the machloket, and that's the Masechet Sofrim. Masechet Sofrim said that if you said the Hallel in the Bet Knesset, so then you don't have to make a bracha at your Seder. So why don't we just simply say the Hallel in the Bet Knesset, get the brownie points that the Masechet Sofrim had said as well, that it's such a wonderful idea of Mashmo Yachdav. In other words, we have this idea that we have a communal setting for Hallel as well, and we get the extra benefit, and when you now are doing it at home, you don't have to make a bracha anymore because you've already said it in Shul. So we have a perfect solution. We have a wonderful idea to say Hallel in Shul in the Tzibur. And by doing so, we cut out the entire controversy of whether I should be saying a bracha in the Seder. So it seems as though this very short piece, here it is, 3-4 lines of the Tur has cut out hundreds of years of controversy. The Tur endorses the custom of saying Hallel in the Shul, which seems to have been dormant for centuries. You start saying Hallel in Shul, and you stop saying the bracha in the Seder. That's where it seems to have come from. The Shulchan Aruch, based on this, the Shulchan Aruch, based on this, says, and this becomes a Sephardic custom, B'leil Rishon shel Pesach Gomrin Hallel b'tzibur b'ni'ima b'bracha tchila v'sof. So he says the one line, this is the standard Sephardic psak, wasn't totally accepted by all Sephardim, but generally most Sephardim accept this. You say Hallel in Shul. Ashkenazim disagree. The Ramah, continuing the standard Ashkenazi custom of not saying Hallel in Shul, says V'chol zeh ein anu noagim. We don't do any of this. Ki ein anu omrim b'layla b'beit knesset Hallel klal. We do not say in Ashkenaz, in Poland, we do not say Hallel at all. And so it would have basically broken down as a machloket between Minhagim of Sfaradim and Minhag of Ashkenazim to say it or not. And then the Hasidim come into it. And the Hasidim, based on the Ari, say that I didn't bring the Ari, based on Kabbalah, say that the idea of saying saying Hallel in Shul in the public forum has tremendous implications on a Kabbalistic level, and the Hasidim adopt it to the point where you have a relatively late Hasidic figure, the Rogatchover. So he, in the beginning of the 20th century, in a tshuva, so he has the following formulation. He says, Anshei Shlomeinu sheyichnu nitznitza behen ruach kodesh v'nibu v'lo yadu ma nibu. So our people, meaning Hasidim, they have this sense of nevuah and have hit upon a deep inner truth. What can I tell you? Right? I could have, if you were a Chassid, I would be able to go into the wonderful depths, but it's enough for you to know it's a good thing to say Hallel in Shul. So you have the Hasidim who now have taken a Sephardic custom through the Arizal and introduced it into Ashkenazic custom. There is a bit of a controversy as to whether the Gra accepted this as well, even though he obviously was not a Chassid, he was one of the major opponents of Chassidim. But on the one hand, he doesn't believe, in a very cryptic statement in the Shulchan Aruch, he says that when explaining the Ramah, that the custom of saying it in Shul was only established. Why in Ashkenaz do we not say it? Because it was only said for those people, the original custom, if you recall, at the very beginning of the Tosefta. Why did we say Hallel in Shul? Because there were people who were ignorant, but people who aren't ignorant, people who can read a Haggadah, read the Hallel, which is all of us today. So there's no need to say Hallel in Shul. So it seems that the Gra did not say it. However, in Lithuania, the minhag is known as minhag hagra seems to be that they did read it to the point where Rav Moshe in the tshuva I believe from the 1950s, it's not dated, but based on when it was published. So he is asked about what should one do if one goes into a shul where they're saying it and your custom is not to say it. And he says that if your custom is not to say Hallel in shul and you find yourself in a shul where they are saying it, you should say the Hallel because you shouldn't be poresh min hatzibur and you shouldn't create controversy. And if you are the chazan, or even in a situation where it will be clearly noticeable that you're not saying the bracha, so he says that im haya ba'ofen sheyeh nikar shelo birech nireh shetzarich gam levarech. So if it's clear that you are not making the bracha, you should make the bracha. Here in Eretz Yisrael, following both minhag hagra, maybe this is why it's called minhag hagra, because in Eretz Yisrael, the Ashkenazic community coming later than the Sephardic community accepted the Sephardic practice of saying Hallel in the Bet Knesset beforehand. And whether this was also the Gra, because the original Ashkenazic settlers in the 19th century, what later became known as the Yeshuva Yashan, they followed basically the Minhag Gra. They were Talmidim of the Gra. In any event, they started saying the bracha. And that became Ashkenazic practice here in Eretz Yisrael. There were those people who did not say the bracha, but the common Ashkenazic practice in Eretz Yisrael is to say Hallel with the Hallel and Shul, and with the bracha, both before and after. There were those people, because of time, I won't get into the people who disagreed and just said it without the bracha. I will just take an extra couple of minutes to talk about a controversy within the world of the Soloveitchiks, within the world of Brisk. The Brisker Rav Velvel, the son of Rav Chaim, who came here in the 1930s and settled here in Israel. So his Talmidim report that he did not say the Hallel in Shul and that he left Shul, which is interesting because the Rav Soloveitchik published his Shurim, his nephew, the Rav Yosef Dov Soloveitchik, published a set of his Shurim in 1983, the Yortzeit Shurim for his father. In one of those Shurim, he says explicitly, it talks about the following custom. He said, mitzvah ligmor et hallel b'tzibur b'leil harishon shel Pesach b'bracha tchila v'sof. And excuse me, I started with Adoni Aviz Keni, meaning my grandfather Rav Chaim, the Rav's grandfather, the Brisker Rav's father. Right? So Rav Chaim was of the opinion that you should say Hallel in Shul. Remember, in Ashkenaz, in Lithuania, there are basically the Misnagdim are not saying it. There are those who say Minhag Hagra is to say it, but the prevalent Minhag is not to say it, and the Hasidim are saying it. So Rav Chaim, as reported by his grandson, said that it was very important to say it. Mitzvah ligmor et Hallel b'tzibur b'leil harishon. Why? And he says he gives I've been primarily talking about it from a historical perspective. He gives it a very clear analytic distinction. And he says that there are two basic halachot. and he says it's a pasuk. The pasuk is in Yeshayahu. Hashir yeh lachem kilel hitkadesh hechad. That there should be a Hallel, a shir, the way, this is Yeshayahu talking about that you will say Hallel the way that you say Hallel at night of Chag. So you see clearly, Rav Chaim says, that there is this idea of saying Hallel in a public forum at the night of Pesach, and it's a pasuk in Yeshayahu, and there are two different halachot. There is the halacha that he says of basically of Leil Seder, of Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim, of Hallel as part of the evening that we are reenacting, and that part of that reenactment is to say Hallel. That's what we do at the Seder. But there is also the idea of Yom Tov, and also the idea of the Kedusha of the Yom, and commemorating something, the commemorating of Kedusha we spoke about before in terms of Hallel in general. And that, as opposed to all other Yomim Tovim, isn't only done in the day, it's also done at night. So there are two different ways of saying it. Now his son, I said the Brisker Rav, is not saying Hallel. What's going on here? And so here's the controversy. In the first printing of the Haggadah of the Beit Levi, which is sort of the Brisker Haggadah, so the editor, presumably based on what I just read in the published shirim of the Rav, and the Rav was still alive at this point. This is written in 1989. So he says that Rav Chaim was of the opinion that you should be saying it. The Briskers here went bananas, and they forced him to recant. And he had a public recantment in Yated Ne'eman, where here is source 23, that he had to say the entire story wasn't true, and it was based on a non-reliable source. Makor Dvarim Biltim Meheman. It was basically, he never quoted the Rav, wouldn't have flown in general to be quoting the Rav in yeshiva circles here, but it was probably where he got it from. Now he has to say that it was an unreliable source. An alternate story develops a few months later and is written in the op-ed pieces of Yated Ne'eman, where Rav Chaim has a completely different story, where Rav Chaim says that you shouldn't be saying Hallel, it's not our minhag. Don't have time to read it, but you're more than welcome to see it yourselves later on. And so it seems as though there is this controversy based that perhaps the Brisker Rav didn't totally accept what his father had said, but people didn't want to say that he wasn't following Rav Chaim. So there is this split that occurs. I'll just close with something that I just saw this past Shabbat. I was leafing through a Haggadah on someone's shelf, a Haggadah where Rabbi David Holzer has put out with various medieval manuscripts along with transcripts or snippets of transcripts of the Rav Shiurim, as opposed to written works that the Rav had said. And here so you have a completely different style to it. And you can see it. So the Rav is talking, and you can almost hear, you can hear the Rav's words here. He says, on the one hand, that Rav Chaim was very much interested in saying Hallel in the shul, but he himself never said Hallel. Right? And the Rav says, my father, Rav Chaim instructed his sons, and he says both of his sons, both Rav Moshe, who was the Rav's father, and the Brisker Rav, Rav Elvel, to say Hallel, but Rav Chaim, would go around going out of the shul and wouldn't say Hallel. And why? The Rav doesn't know why. And the Rav says, I don't know why. My father didn't know why. It's a chidas stuma, that's his term. It's a puzzle. I don't know why Rav Chaim didn't say Hallel, even though he instructed his sons and his grandsons to say Hallel, but he says, but that's my minhag, and that's the way that I do it, and that we instructed based on that chakira, which he developed in a much more organized fashion, not off the cuff in the shir, but in the written work, explaining the difference. So, in terms of just summing it up, you have a minhag which begins in the time of the Tosefta for people who don't know how to say Hallel at the Seder. It over the course of the next few hundred years, it becomes the standard practice in Eretz Yisrael and something which is considered to be very praiseworthy and laudable. Then it goes dormant for hundreds of years. It starts up again in the 14th century because of the tour, wanting people not to have to say a bracha at their Seder. Sephardim do it, Ashkenazim don't do it, Hasidim bring it in, and then at the end, which are minhag here in Eretz Yisrael, following the Gra, and perhaps Rav Chaim as well, almost all Ashkenazim will say Hallel with the bracha in the Bet Knesset. Wish everyone, whatever your minhag is when it comes to Hallel and all your other minhagim, a chag kasher v'sameach.
That's hello.
Question, Mike? Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, please.
Could you coordinate that in historic periods of time, what was politically going on in the world, so that if things were going bad for the parents, they had a memory of one kind and then the children are different? Was there any political?
So I don't know. There's so many different things that are going on. And you see, for example, just the question of saying a bracha at the Hallel. So I said that there was a controversy going on for hundreds of years.
Yeah.
So you take the example of the Ashkenazim at that time in the 12th century, 12th and 13th century. Excuse me, where it comes up. So people in the same family, Rabbeinu Tam, for example, is saying that you should not say a Hallel with a bracha. His grandnephew, the Rabbi Yitzchak ben Avraham, is the primary source for saying it amongst Ashkenazim, amongst the Balei Tosfot. So it seemed to be a question of that, that he didn't know what his great uncle did at his Seder. He was a student of his great uncle.
But my question not geared to his family necessarily, but more to whether it would be pretty hard to say Hallel during the massacres in Europe. I'm just wondering if that type of thing was a factor.
I don't know. I can't say. I think that that for the massacres in Europe and elsewhere, for that matter, were such a standard feature of Jewish life, both for the people who were saying Hallel and for those people who weren't saying Hallel.
But when, for example, today, saying Hallel for religious Zionists is much easier than not saying it.
Right, that's certainly true. Thank God that we're in that.
I mean, so maybe there was an element of that. The father lived through a korban, the son did not. Something, but you're in better times. Say Hallel, but leave me alone, says the father.
It could be. I as I said, I don't see a pattern per se, but perhaps if we looked at it a little more carefully, we'd find the pattern. But
it's interesting research. It's
yeah,
you're into it. It may be interesting feature.
Right.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Chag kosher
Sheva sameach to everyone.
We have a 10-minute holiday.
No, because Rob Taylor's here and we need to get going on the next year.
That's what I was wondering. Okay.